Good morning, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Okay, great. All right, so I apologize. We had a little bit of technical difficulties this morning, and since no one was actually here, you guys are all online for me. I figured I would just go ahead and come and do it in my office instead of being in the training room. That gives me a little bit less feedback, and I'll be able to hear you guys a little bit better. So don't forget to put in the chat if you guys have any questions. And I hopefully, all right, let me see if Ryan can upload the docs. So I'll get that, see if I can get him to do that real quick. Hey, Ryan, will you upload those addendums into the chat for them? Perfect. Okay. Oh, there we go. Beautiful. Okay, perfect. All right, so we are going to start back off for those who were at the contracts class. We're going to go through the addendums we did not get to do the last time. So hopefully you guys were in the contracts class. If you weren't, that is now an option to watch on the recording. So we're going to just basically go through some of the things that you would add to a contract and kind of talk about what exactly you would need to use. So if you guys have any questions, again, feel free. You can unmute yourself too if you guys want to and ask questions as we go along. And then also if you want to put anything in the chat as well. The first one we're going to do is the VA FHA addendum. That one's probably most used. I think that that's probably one that you're putting on a lot of contracts. And one of the things that I want to talk about is how or what contract you would use this with and why you would use it with that particular contract. One of the things that is happening right now is there are a couple of companies that are not allowing you to use the as-is contract with this particular addendum. So I wanted to talk just briefly about the reasoning behind that. I have always used this addendum with the as-is contract and never really had an issue with it with most realtors. But then this past year, we had some backlash with a couple of companies because technically, if you use it with the as-is, you don't have that option if the appraiser is FHA or VA and they come back and they ask for repairs. And so technically you aren't as is. And so that's why there were a couple of brokerages that said, you know, you really can't put a FHA or VA addendum on an as is contract because it's not really as is. And so that's why some of them are saying you cannot use the two. So if you start at the beginning and it gives you that section 1, which is just definitions, but then section 2, it says inspections and appraisals. So in addition to the requirements of paragraph 12 of the contract, which is your regular inspections, the seller shall comply with applicable FHA or VA regulations regarding the termite inspection, roof inspection, and appraisal repairs, collectively appraisal repairs. The cost to the seller for appraisal repairs shall not exceed, and you're going to put a number in there. So if you put $500, if you put $1,000, if you put whatever in there, that is the maximum the seller is agreeing to pay for in that section. So for example, if you've already put an as-is contract type of deal and you're saying that the seller doesn't have to pay for anything in regards to regular inspections, but then you're worried about what the appraisal would come back at you with, this is the section that you would put that there. So knowing that an appraiser is going to check less than a regular inspector, you're worried about those items here. So FHA, VA, they're going to be checking for certain things. The flooring, they're going to make sure that the appliances are intact. Specifically, the stove has to be there and it has to be working. They're going to make sure the HVAC is working. They're going to make sure that the water heater works and that it's not leaking. They're also going to make sure that the roof is not leaking and that they don't see any specific wear and tear that they can see with their eye. They may not get on the roof, but they're definitely going to look for water stains. They're going to look for wood rot that's visible on the exterior, things like that. They've also been picky about flooring, especially if they're looking at mobile homes. They've been looking at, flooring that's coming up. And a lot of times you have that contraction when you're looking at the pergo flooring or you're looking at vinyl flooring, where it starts to like contract during the summer and winter months. And you'll have that pop-ups kind of pieces where they'll come apart. So I've had a lot of that happen. If you have sink drains that are rusted out, I've seen them do that. Screens on porches. So a lot of things like that. Electrical outlets that are coming off the wall. If there's any cords, on the exterior. So if you have like any of your cables or anything like that that are hanging loose that they can see, they will notate that kind of thing. So just remember, paint chipping was on one recently. We had to repaint a house in areas where paint chipping was an issue. We had a deck that had to be redone because it was a little bit rotten and soft. So a wood deck had to be redone on a VA. So just remember, there's a lot of things that these VA appraisers are going to be looking at. So if you go into it, yes, ma'am, I see a hand raised. Go ahead.
Sorry, I always ask so many questions, but this is really great information. So for example, you said in addition, so if on the WDO, they put $1,000, and then let's say they put $1,000 on this, and the total WDO to get all the wood rot out is 1,500. So would they first use the like 1,000 from the actual contract and then tap into another 500 of this?
So it could be. So let's say the WDO repair is 1,000. But then the appraisal comes back and notates additional wood rot. You could get that could be because that's kind of what happened with us. We had wood damage that was notated obviously on a WDO, but then the appraiser notated additional items. She wanted the deck also done. So we kind of covered it with all our, it was like we couldn't get past the appraisal either. So it was like, look, you're not getting past the appraiser either. So it kind of combined it all. Sometimes it's going to be also according to the seller and whether the seller is willing to work with you. It's like you've got this and it's totals. You get agreed 1,000 here and 1,000 here. So really you've got 2,000. So are you willing to give up that total of 2,000? You really kind of already agreed to it, right? So really you've got the total of 2,000. You only have to pay 1,500. So you were agreeing to 2,000 anyways. Are you just going to be okay with 1,500? The answer should be yes, right? So, but do you have other appraisal issues? Were there more than that in other items? So you may get into a sticky situation if you have more than $500 in other appraisal items. So, that's the issue where you kind of have to be cognizant of what all is wrong with the house and what might come up according to an appraisal item with an actual VA or FHA appraiser, and what is that seller really willing to do, and have that conversation up front before you write the offer. Is this seller aware of all these issues, and are they going to be willing to work with that buyer when that comes up? So make sure that you have that conversation and that you're talking to the other agent when you're writing it. FHA financing is that second box. That's number 3. Again, your appraised value of the property may not be less than, and so you're writing the purchase price there. That's your financing contingency, your appraised value contingency, whatever you want to say there. They do have options of paying more on most of these nowadays, but it does give you the option of backing out if they want to, if it doesn't appraise. Now, the one thing I will say about the documents here, the appraisal repairs here is also limited there. If it's going to be more on the FHA, it gives the seller to pay less than the full amount of the excess cost. Purchaser can elect to pay the balance and cancel the contract. So it does give them some some leeway there if they do not want to keep going, if there's too much to be done for the repairs. VA financing, they are agreeing to pay the fees that the buyer is not allowed to pay. Right now, most of the VA loans do not have any costs. There are very few of them I've seen recently where they're charging them any sort of fees. So the good news is, even though this document says that the seller would pay their fees, there are very few that are actually charging them fees. There are almost none of them, and especially if they're using Keller Mortgage, or we have a lot of good lenders in town. Most of the good lenders in town are not charging VA closing costs and funky fees. Just make sure if you use a lender, that you're asking to see their closing cost breakdown for VA, because this would put a seller on the hook for a bunch of their costs, because this says that the seller has to pay it, not the buyer. So understand that the VA veteran does not have to pay any fees according to this document. So they can't pay their WDO, they can't pay, I think it's like their, it's WDO, tax service, underwriting, doc prep fees, recording fees, none of that. So if that's being charged by the lender, then the seller pays all of that. And the seller may not be willing to pay that. So just make sure that you have a lender that's not charging them that. So like I said, right now, I haven't seen very many VA loans that are charging those fees to veterans. But if you have a, wackadoo VA lender that's trying to throw some under the table, make sure you've seen their settlement charges up front before you use somebody that you're not familiar with. Usually the WDO is not an issue. Most sellers are okay with paying that. If not, you might be willing to negotiate that and pay that for them. I've done that a couple of times. If I've got a seller that's just really, I don't want to pay anything, blah, 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 then I'll just pay that WDO for my buyer and make it work. Or the buyer themselves will pay it, and then it's something that's done outside of closing, and you just don't have it. You've got to have it look like the seller paid for it. Because the seller it has to look like the seller paid for it. It can't look like the buyer paid for it. So that's the deal with the VA. So the VA will not allow the buyer to pay for it. Appraisal repairs, again, on those, there's just it's limit imposed by paragraph 2. The seller must, within 3 days after receiving notice of the excess cost, give the purchaser written notice of the seller's intention to pay some, all, or none of the excess amount. So if they're not going to do it, they got to let you know, and then you get 3 days to walk or continue. Election to proceed with contract. If they again agree to do it, then you've got 3 days for them to move forward. The good, bad, and the ugly of VA and FHA appraisals, they stick with the property for 6 months. So if it does not appraise, remind the other agent that if they do not choose to move forward, that appraisal sticks with the property, not the buyer, for 6 months. So if it comes in low and they won't agree to move forward with your customer, they cannot sell it to another VA or FHA property or buyer for 6 months at anything higher than that number. So it is advantageous for them to work with you guys. So that's just a negotiation tactic y'all can use. Anybody else have any questions on FHA VA addendum and how it works? Okay, excellent. We will move on. All right, let's talk about contingency. We're going to talk about sale of buyer's property and the kickout clause kind of together, but we're going to go with full contingency first. So we're going to look at addendum V, which is sale of buyer's property. Right now, we have a lot of people who obviously have to sell their house and then buy another, and they're having problems like finding a house before they sell theirs kind of deal, because it's like this market is weird we can't find one to sell one. Our house is going to sell really quick. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on, or mine's going to sell really quick before I find one. So contingencies are not really a big deal right now, but they used to be. So they may come back into play later on. Um, when it was a buyer's market, contingencies were all the time happening. So it's a pretty simple addendum. It is a simple one because it's really just one paragraph. It is essentially the contract is contingent upon the sale of the buyer's property. So you're going to take the address of wherever they live now. You're going to put that address in that first sentence block, located at, and then you're going to be contract with a third party, obviously, if it does not close by. So you're going to put a timeline on this. So 90 days, 120 days, whatever it is. If you want 12 months, whatever everybody's going to agree to, you're going to put a timeline there. Now, if they already have a contract, you're going to check that box. Buyer's property is presently under contract. If that's not, you're going to check is not. And you're going to provide a copy before blank. So if you've already got the contract, you're going to say before and then put a couple of days, a week, whatever. So that helps you with that particular situation. So you've already gotten a contract, you're going to provide them within 3 days, within 10 days, whatever it is. This particular situation with this having a contingent contract, typically what I will tell you with these is if I'm going to go in and I'm going to make a contingency offer, if I know my other house has a contract on it, I'm going to go ahead and try to negotiate that up front. I'm going to say, look, we've already got it listed. I can provide you a copy of the contract. Here's where it's listed. Even if it's listed, I'm going to give them copies of that so that that's looking like we're already making movement on it to try to help them get that offer accepted. So all of that can help you within this contingency. If the buyer has a contingency and the seller says, well, I don't want to take my house off the market because I don't know how long it's going to take to sell it, then you can use Addendum X, which is Kickout Clause. So the Kickout Clause allows the seller to keep marketing the property as active, but it seals the deal for your buyer as far as terms and price until another buyer walks in the door. Also, let's say your buyer has the ability to get a bridge loan or take out a HELOC or remove money from their 401k or a money market, but they really don't want to do that. That's like their last resort. They would prefer to sell their house first. So Kickout Clause would be ideal for someone like that because they can try to sell their house. If another buyer walked in the door and they had to do one of those other things, then it would be kind of poop or get off the pot situation. So the Kickout Clause would force their hand. This would be ideal for them because the Kickout Clause is if another buyer walks in the door and the seller provides a copy of that other offer to your buyer, then and only then do they remove the sale of buyer's property contingency and move forward with their original offer. In this Kickout Clause, the terms become entering into a backup contract. Seller would give buyer a copy with the third party's identification obliterated, which means blacked out. To continue with the primary contract, they're going to make an additional deposit. So you've got to decide. Typically, I would say in your initial offer, make a low deposit and then have that secondary deposit be your full. So let's say you're going to have like a $3,000 to $5,000 total deposit. Make $1,000 deposit be the initial, and then make that $4,000 to $2,000 deposit be your additional. So you're going to make that low deposit up front, and then that full rest of it be that I'm going to move forward, and this is going to be our real, hey, we're moving. That has to be done within 3 days of that seller providing you that third party backup contract. copy. Once you make that secondary deposit as the buyer, now you've removed the sale of buyer's property contingency. You are now in full contract mode. You are moving forward as the buyer. Does everybody follow that? Anybody have any questions about that? Let's talk about inspections. Unless you specifically write that you do not do inspections up front, you would do your inspections as if it was a normal contract, even with a addendum V on it. Does everybody follow that? So you would do your inspections just from the date of execution, unless you write in there that you're not going to do your inspections until your buyer's property sells. Okay? So if your buyer doesn't want to pay for inspections until their property sells, you got to write that in there. Okay? If your buyer wants to close a certain timeline, so for example, the closing date, if you write a date in there and your buyer's property hasn't closed, then that date is null and void. So you can also write 30 days from the date of sale of property, buyer's property. So you can use things like that. So there are ways to write the contract to make it work for this sale. So if there's any of those kind of things that you want to utilize within that contract, you can also do those things. And I highly recommend doing it that way because it will make it easier for you when you actually get to rolling out of this contingency. Anybody have any questions on any of that? Okay. All right. We're rolling good today. All right. Backup contracts. So if you are in a multiple offer situation, which I think a lot of us have been in these lately, you might want to be a backup contract. I highly recommend being backup contracts because these days we have a lot of buyer's remorse going on. We go in, there are 15 offers, buyers are scared, they're just making random offers because they're frightened they're going to lose it. Half the time they're not even seeing the property, they're making offers from some other place. They didn't even get to see the house. So half the time they go see the house after they made the offer and then they're like, oh, I don't like this, and then they back out. So if your buyer is a serious buyer, I highly recommend asking to be the backup. So the addendum that you can use to be the backup is Addendum W, which is backup contract. It basically says backup is subject to the termination of a prior executed contract between the seller and a third party for the sale of the property. If the prior executed contract is terminated and the seller delivers written notice of the termination to the buyer before 5 p.m. on whatever the date you put in there, this contingency shall be removed and the backup contract shall move into first position. You want this signed and the rest of the contract signed because then that reserves you and your buyer as the number one place as the backup. So if their original contract goes, you've got number one space. Saves you guys from being put off to number 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, if that first person does go out of space. So I highly recommend pressing to be the backup offer if your buyer lost out in a negotiation. And get it signed. Does anybody have any questions about the backup offer? You guys are being so quiet today. Okay.
I have a question. Can the seller ever back out of the backup offer? Like if they get a second backup offer that's actually stronger?
Not if they signed it.
Not if they signed it. Okay.
But you got to get it signed. That's the deal. Like if they just verbally say, yes, you can be the backup offer, then of course. But if they've fully signed it and it's all executed, and then that first offer goes to, then you've got that signed backup offer, then you've got grounds to be it.
Cool.
So that's why you want to get it signed. All right, so let's talk about let's do short sale let's do short sale. We don't have a lot of these anymore. but they happen every once in a while. So it's important to kind of know how they work. I just did one not too long ago and it was random. It was very random that we had one, but they do happen occasionally. So short does not mean time short. It means that the bank is getting shorted. So essentially the seller owed the bank more money than the property's worth, and now they are getting shorted in terms of money. So the short sale addendum is going to go on the contract because it outlines how the bank is going to communicate, how the seller is going to communicate, and how the buyer is going to be basically related to from everybody. So it's going to, the beginning of it is the short sale approval. So its contract is contingent upon the seller obtaining short sale approval from the lender and all lien holders, collectively lender. This is the kicker here because there may be more than one person involved, and person meaning lenders. It can be mortgage number one, mortgage number two. It can be a mortgage insurance company. So there may be three, there may be five, there may be seven parties involved that have to sign off on this amount of money that's being offered before this would be approved. So understand that that's why this can take a lot of time. And all of these people have to say yes to the terms before your contract can be approved and then move forward to the sale. Agrees to a reduced payoff and provides satisfaction or releases of the mortgage and any other liens encumbering the property. Agrees to release the seller from any claims of deficiency and notes secured by the mortgages. Seller must deliver a copy of the approval within 7 days after receipt, but no later than 45 of left bank of approval deadline. So you guys, as the buyer's agent, are going to put in deadlines here because your buyer only wants to wait X number of days. However, this doesn't have to be, I'm going to walk away either. You can choose to extend it. If the lender makes an offer to the seller that does not include above and contains additional terms or obligations, the seller may, but is not required to accept the offer. If the seller accepts the offer, it will be deemed short sale approval and seller delivers the copy to the buyer. If applicable, seller's lender has set the list price and approved this property for short sale. Now, sometimes they've already preset the price and that can be checked by this box. Short sale application, the seller will make application. Sometimes they haven't even made application for short sale. So that can be put in here if you need to make them make application. Time periods, we're going to put in here that, whatever time periods are going to start within a certain time. So the effective date for the short sale application, if they've already done so, approval deadline, contract deadline, initial deposit, inspection periods. So you can set all of those things up in this particular addendum. So if you want the deposit to be from the time that they make approval, if you want the inspections to start from the approval, which I highly recommend that you don't make your person's money and inspection start until you actually get an approval. So don't make them put a deposit down. Don't make them do inspections until you get short sale approval, because otherwise it's not really a contract. They don't really have anything until the bank approves it. Once the bank approves it, then you start actually being a contract. So backup offers and contracts. Now the seller may receive backup offers. There's no reason they can't receive backup offers, because if your buyer decides to walk away because it takes 6 months, let the seller do that. There's no reason they can't, because your buyer may get frustrated and leave the scene. So I always say there's no reason that you don't let them do that, because it's unfortunate for them if your buyer walks away because it takes too long. And it doesn't hurt your buyer to do that, because they can't not go forward with your buyer just because there's a backup. If you have a signed contract and your signed contract is still in force, there's no reason you can't move forward. Closing date and termination. Buyer agree to extend the closing date, and you can put days there. So you could put 365 days if your buyer is willing to wait that long. If you know your buyer needs a house by a certain date, put that many days and then leave it at that, because after that date, they're going to have to go find something else. Buyer acknowledgement, they're just, the lender is not a party to this contract and they don't have to do what we tell them to do. Seller acknowledgement that the short sale may be a taxable event. And then that's really the end of it. Does anybody have any questions about how a short sale works or how this addendum affects anybody? Okay. If you guys do later on and you get involved in a short sale, just call me. I did like 400 of these between 2010 and 2015. All right. Lead-based paint and HOA disclosures. I think a lot of you guys have been doing these, but I just want to make sure that we're knowledgeable about how these work and that they go on contracts. The lead-based paint disclosure, if it is pre-1978, they do need to be filled out properly. There is a pamphlet that you need to be handing out to your customer whenever you have a house that is pre-1978. If you do not have copies of this pamphlet, there is a downloadable copy that you can send via PDF. You need to be doing that because it says in the contract, and it is a requirement by the state law that you do it. There also is a Spanish version if you have someone that does not speak English or does not read English. So make sure that you're doing that because it says that you've given them that in this document. So just make sure that you are having everybody sign it, that you are giving them the pamphlet, because lead-based paint is very important, that you are making people knowledgeable of what it can do. And I mean, ultimately nowadays, most houses are not made with lead paint, but even the ones that were built in 78, the paint's been painted and 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 painted over. But if they're going to go in and they're going to do remodeling, they're going to tear down walls. There are some things they need to be careful of doing, especially if they're trying to do it themselves. If they hire a contractor that knows what they're doing, they're going to take precautions. But if they're trying to do DIY stuff, they need to be very careful what they're doing. Does anybody have any questions about lead-based paint? Okay, good. All right, would you use a backup offer in conjunction with escalation? In terms of what specifically, Crystal? Because if they escalated to a certain number, let's say, so if you were an escalation clause and you didn't win, somebody else did, I mean, here's the thing. If you wrote an escalation clause and you didn't win, you could still be the backup offer, but at that point, the other offer won. You're going to have a conversation with the other agent. When I've done this, when I've been a backup offer, after the contract is signed, you're going to have a conversation with the other agent. The other agent is still going to negotiate with you on the backup offer. The seller and the buyer are still going to negotiate that backup offer. So more than likely, the agent and you are going to have a conversation. So I would say that your conversation is going to be, what would the seller take as the backup offer? More than likely, they're going to the other agent is going to tell you, well, the other contract was X dollars, so your backup offer needs to be at least that. And that's the way it's gone with most of the ones I've written. They're at that point, the other offer's already negotiated. And so in order to be the backup offer, the agent's going to say, well, this is what we ended up at, so you're going to have to be this in order to be the backup offer. Does that make sense, Crystal? Okay. And if they don't, then you may just have to leave your would they accept your contract the way it is? And they may accept it or they may not, or they may counter it. So if they either sign it or they don't, or they'll counter it. All right, homeowners association document or disclosure, same kind of thing with lead-based paint. If you have a homeowners association, make sure you're adding the homeowner association document to it. One thing I will note on here, there is a second page to the one you should be using. The bottom of it has payment of fees, assessments, and other association charges. Just be aware that right now we have a couple of places that do have additional charges. We have some CDD fees, and we have, like, for example, Turkey Creek has a special assessment for the golf course. So you need to be asking your customer what those additional fees are and making sure they're filling it out properly, because it is very important to tell them what those fees are. Also, Hale Plantation has multiple association fees. So make sure that you are writing all that out so that people understand that different areas have different fees for different things, so that they know what they're paying for. Because people just get confused and they want to know what all they're paying for. Because that's not going to be, some people paid it up front in Turkey Creek, but then some people are paying it monthly. So make sure that you ask your homeowner what they're paying, how they're paying it. Can they get you a copy of it? You might want to also verify it by calling the HOA and getting a copy of it. But it's just important that you have the accurate information, because it will tell you, I've seen it where somebody didn't get the accurate information, and then after the fact, the new buyer wants to sue everybody because then they're paying a special assessment that they did not know about. And so just be very careful with that. You want to make sure you have accurate information about homeowner association dues, and make sure that they're filling it out themselves, that you are not filling it out for them. And, asking for a current copy of whatever they paid, the most recent copy of their HOA, and have them sign. So, because it's very important that that's accurate. And especially with like I said, these special assessments right now, making sure that you're using that second page and not just filling out the first page. So, do you have any questions about either of those things? Okay. All right. And last thing, it's not really an addendum, but we just figured we would throw it in here because it is sort of a document that you use in correlation to the contract, is the release and cancellation. If you are going to release or cancel a contract, there is a document. It's called the release and cancellation of contract. You can use it for either the regular residential or the as is, or the vacant land, or the commercial contract. So you can really use it for any of them. It just gives a release of liability for the buyer and the seller, and it also outlines the disbursement of escrow funds to either the buyer or the seller. This document allows you to cancel the contract and release the escrow funds. It is important to have that document signed by the parties, both parties, because it releases the funds and the liability for brokers. So make sure that if the contract is ending, that you are utilizing this document to release everybody and get those escrow funds released back to the buyer. Now, if the buyer did not give notice prior to the inspection period and the financing period, then who does the money go back to? Does anybody have any clue what happens if the buyer did not give notice before inspections and financing period is over? Who would get the money? It's the seller. So, yep, the seller. So the seller would get the money, and unfortunately, that is our job to make sure that we are watching those inspection periods and the financing periods. If you know that you are outside of your inspection period and then you've got your financing period coming up, you've got to make sure that you are letting your buyer know that they have to make a decision. It is time to say, I want to move forward or I don't, because otherwise their deposit is in play. So make sure that you are watching those dates. If the date's coming up and they are not ready to move forward, then you've got to decide where you're going with it, and then let them know so your deposit's either going forward or you're going to ask for that release cancellation. This is your document to go forward with it or not. And that is pretty much it. Do you guys have any questions on any of those documents? Any other addendums that you guys have seen? I mean, there's some other ones. There's actually a homeowner's insurance one too that you could be using right now. I know that everybody's kind of concerned about homeowners insurance. So if you have a property that's in a flood zone, you could use that homeowners insurance addendum, because it does actually say that if it exceeds a certain amount, you would not want to proceed. So you could use that document, that particular addendum. So there is that one, if you wanted to use that to cover a property that might be in a flood zone. So there is a document for that, or an addendum for that, that you could use. Just know that there is that option. There is a right to cancel if you're going to use a residential contract. You can use the right to cancel addendum. That makes a regular residential contract basically an as is. So that addendum moves it to giving you the same coverage that an as is does. So it gives you that right to cancel. So you can add that addendum on to a regular residential contract. So there's a couple of other addendums that are good to use. If you guys ever have any questions about certain addendums that you see, especially at that last page of the contract, there's a lot on there that we don't really use very often. There's a lot of coastal ones that you'll never have to use here really, unless you were, selling something on the beach or in Cedar Key or something. But we also have two really good post-occupancy and pre-occupancy that are GACR forms. So they are available under MLS. They are not in our actual documents within .loop, but they are in GACR forms. So if you go into GACR, you can get the post-occupancy and you can get the pre-occupancy forms. They're great documents to use if you're going to do a pre-occupancy or a post-occupancy. They were written by Chick Holden, who is our board attorney. They do have a lot of hold harmless wording in there. They give great options for dates and terms and per diems if you're going to have somebody stay over. Remember, if you're doing a VA, 60 days is the max that someone can do a post-occupancy. That is the allowable time for VA. So if anybody's staying over that, they cannot stay more than 60 days. So those are just some things to remember if you're doing any post-occupancy for VA loans. And FHA may have the same nowadays too, but I know VA definitely does a 60-day. And if you guys have any other questions on addendums, feel free to reach out to me. I will put my cell phone number here in the chat so you guys have it. I hope you have a great rest of your week. And would we attach the VA financing addendum form along with the FHA VA? Yeah, so yes. So you're going to use that addendum with the regular residential contract. So that's the addendum you would use. And you can see, I use it with as is if I know the house is in good shape. And I know that, especially if it's like a newer house. I just sold a house in Westchester that was 2018. So I did an as-is contract, and then I put like $500 in the appraisal section because I was pretty sure there wasn't going to be anything, but we stuck, $500 in there just in case there was some little something that happened to come up. And that worked out fine for us because it was a company I knew. It was another KW agent. So I knew they weren't gonna have an issue with it. But if it's Watson or Remax, they will not allow you to write an as is with an FHA VA addendum. You've got to write it on a regular residential. Again, because technically you can't really have an as is with an FHA VA, because if that appraisal comes back with anything on it, it's not really as is. So you gotta work it the way they prefer it worked. So anybody have any other questions? All righty, guys. Well, y'all have a wonderful rest of your week, and hopefully I'll see everybody tomorrow at Red Day. Y'all have a good one.